Great. So everybody, please be welcomed to the grand finals of the 2022 Oak Cup. Today, we'll be facing St. Catherine Moreland School from Belgrano as a proposition against Colegio San Jorge of Godoy Cruz as the opposition. They'll be debating the motion. This house believes that the Ukrainian government should negotiate with Putin to end the war. Representing St. Catherine Moreland School of Belgrano, we'll have Isabel Cancian as the first speaker, Felix Bremro as the second speaker, and Thomas Emch as the third speaker, with Felix giving and delivering the reply speech. Representing Colegio San Jorge of Godoy Cruz, we'll have Guillermina Carbonell as the first speaker, Camila Castillo as the second speaker, and Santiago Ferrari as the third speaker, with Camila delivering the reply speech. I'm sure all of you are very nervous and eager to begin with this endeavor. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Isabel Cancian to open this case for all of us. Please welcome her.
Hi, can you hear me correctly? Yes? So I will start now. Wars can end in two possible endings. First, complete destruction, or peace. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me remind you that the motion before us today is this House believes the Ukrainian government should negotiate with Putin to end the war. First of all, to characterize the motion, we mean by negotiations to end the war, open diplomatic channels as well as just military in order to de-escalate the conflict and eventually end the war in peace. The war has been going on since February, and it has become a prominent topic in the international community. Over the last couple of weeks, concerns and the debate of whether this should be taken into peace talks has arisen amongst international community members. Therefore, considering the possible outcomes of having peace talks and negotiations, we stand for the only pragmatic solution to the conflict, the best available solution given the current context of the war and the Ukrainian government, and third, minimizing the effects of the war until its eventual resolution. Our case is divided into three main arguments. First of all, the end, which would prove that the peace talks are the only pragmatic and realistic solution to the war. The second argument, called the best, where we prove that given the Ukrainian government's context and international community right now, it is the best time to consider peace talks. And third of all, the last, where we debate and we prove how peace talks will also minimize the other effects of the war until it is eventually solved through peace. So I'll start developing the first argument, the end. Every day that the war goes on, we are closer to disaster. The possibility of escalation grows bigger. And in fact, even the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe grows closer. In fact, for example, there are bombings near Ukrainian nuclear plants every single day. We need to do something. We all agree that ending the war should be, and ensuring peace should be, a top priority right now. Moreover, ensuring the safety of Ukrainian citizens, ensuring that people and families are no longer displaced, that they can go back to their homes, should also be a priority for us. If we do not consider peace negotiations, there's three possible endings to the war. First of all, Ukrainian destruction. Second of all, and very not likely, a Russian destruction. And third of all, Putin being completely replaced. No, thank you. Neither of these solutions are desirable or even realistic. They're not going to end the war. We're just toying with the future. We're just assuming that eventually it will be solved in favor of Ukraine, but in reality, every day we're closer to danger. However, negotiations offer a new alternative. They offer the possibility of peace, of dialogue, of de-escalation.
Point of information.
A viable way in the war. Yes.
How are you sure that these negotiations will assure that peace that you are suggesting, as both countries have different ideas?
I understand your point. But because when you open diplomatic channels where both governments are represented, and in fact in support of the international community, as I will develop in the second argument, then you're ensuring democratic and peace negotiations. You cannot ensure that only with war. If there's no diplomatic relationships, if there's no peace negotiations, with war, you won't ensure peace. You will ensure destruction, whether it is in Ukraine, in Russia, or in both countries alike. Nevertheless, opening the channels of diplomatic dialogue and starting a process towards peace through diplomacy will start de-escalation, no thank you, and which will eventually lead to peace. Even if it's not immediate, it is the best viable option to end the war. So in this argument, we have proven that it is the best solution available. It doesn't matter how long it takes. It is the best solution available right now. Every day that goes by, we grow closer to destruction, of annihilation, of death, injury, and even nuclear disasters. And it leads back to the motion because the Ukrainian government should consider peace negotiations with Putin in order to end the war. Moving on to the second argument, called the best, which is developed into two layers of analysis. First of all, that it is the best time, given the context of the war and the context of Ukraine as a country, to consider this option. Winter is approaching, and in winter, progress is less likely to be made for both sides. This entails two things. First of all, that Ukraine will probably go into a stalemate, and second of all, that Russian aggression will probably decrease. Therefore, it is the best time, given context, to consider peace negotiations. It is the best time for Ukraine to actually start considering the possibility of dialogue with Putin.
Point of information.
Moreover, thank you. Given Russia's strategic bombing of infrastructure, it's the best time to consider, because if it's in the winter, Russia continues with the strategy with no other option or other channels of dialogue to solve the conflict, then vital infrastructure for the winter, like sewages or hot water, will be not available for Ukrainian citizens, which is a concern that should be kept in mind when debating how to end the war. Therefore, taking into account the current context of the war and of the Ukrainian government, it is key for them to consider peace negotiations with Putin through diplomacy. Because given the context, it is less likely for the conflict to develop in their favor, and Russian aggression will decrease for this month, which gives them the perfect window of opportunity to dialogue with Putin without immediate threat. Moving on to the second layer, which is the stage of the international community. NATO, which is one of Ukraine's biggest allies, has shown support for peace negotiations. In fact, the USA, one of the biggest supports of Ukraine in terms of, no, thank you, in terms of diplomacy and aid, has expressed that they are open to, and they encourage Ukraine to negotiate with Putin. The Ukraine should take advantage of this support, because it means that the chances of getting a more favorable agreement with Putin and Russia increases. When they have the whole world in their side in negotiations, it is most likely for Russia to agree to a peace settlement that favors Ukrainian interests. If Ukraine does not take the international community's opinion, it risks isolating itself, and one, not only not being favorable for them at the current context of the war, but two, not being favorable for them when they eventually consider peace negotiations. However, given that they have the support right now of the international community, they need to consider this option at the present time and take advantage of this support in order to ensure, no, thank you, to ensure the best available agreement for their country. So in this argument, we have proven that not only it is the best time for the Ukrainian government to negotiate with Putin, given the context of the war or the Ukrainian government in itself, it is the perfect time for them to consider peace negotiations, given the amount of international support that they have. NATO, being one of its key allies, has shown support for peace talks, which means that Putin is more likely to agree on certain terms and to discuss openly and fairly a peace agreement, given the international support overwhelmingly supports this decision in favor, of course, of Ukraine. Therefore, this links back to the motion, because supporting peace talks and negotiations in order to end the war at this current time is vital for Ukraine in order to ensure a favorable agreement with Russia. Because missing this window of opportunity could mean that in the future, this opportunity is no longer available, or is available, but not in the best interest of Ukraine, but of Russia, which would not be ideal in order to ensure a true democratic peace agreement. So in order to summarize the first two arguments, it's important to keep in mind that it is the best pragmatic solution, and it's also the best time to implement it. So we beg opposition to give peace a chance.
Thank you very much. Time was 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to invite Guillermina Carbonell to open the case for the opposition. Please welcome her.
We all know how this story ends. Let's try a new ending. Good afternoon, judges, audience, and my worthy opponents. Today we are here to debate whether the Ukrainian government should negotiate with Putin to end the war or not. And this house is in complete opposite of this motion. Before I develop the case, I want to accept the definition the proposition has brought today and do some clarifications that there seems to be needed for this debate. We all want the war to end, but we want to reach a real world coexistence. The war has to end, but the bad guys don't have to win. The opposition house expects that the proposition is able to prove throughout the debate that negotiations will bring world peace for a long term, avoiding future war scenarios. Throughout these negotiations, the human rights will be guaranteed, and these negotiations will not cooperate with the advance of the imposition of the Russian culture suppressing the Ukrainian one. Finally, that this will help to preserve democracy and not cooperate with Putin's interests of spreading an authoritarian model. Throughout the debate, the opposition house will bring the following three arguments. The historical one, let's stop tripping with the same rock over and over. Then the cultural one, a fight or an extermination campaign. And then we will close with the political one, surrendering Ukraine in a civil pattern. First of all, I want to do some certain refutal for the proposition house. We all want a war, so you don't have to beg for us to think in a peace world, because we want to end war, but we don't want to apply these solutions that would also minimize the war. We want real solutions to really end the war. No, thank you. How can you ensure that they are going to be diplomatic negotiations if we know that Putin is not a diplomatic man? If we know that Russia has fight for the territories and for the power over and over, and does not ensure that he is going to do diplomatic relations, because we are here debating that Ukraine has to negotiate with Putin and not with other Russian governments.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Then, don't you think that it will be better, for example, an international agreement or something that will include other patterns, but not only negotiating with Putin, that will be obviously thinking on benefit themselves and not on benefiting the world peace and on benefit Ukrainians? And what about the moment? The moment isn't now, because as we heard in the conference 15 days ago, the president of Ukraine is in complete opposition of negotiation with Putin, because, as we know, Putin is not a diplomatic man. So, continue with my first argument, the historical. No, thank you. Let's stop tripping with the same rock over and over. This debate, argument is divided in two layers of analysis, starting with the worldwide perspective. Historically, negotiations has only calmed things for a short amount of time, but in the long run, it led to the bigger catastrophes on the world. It is unrealistic to negotiate with forced manners as Ukraine should negotiate. It is forced, and it is not that they intend to negotiate with Putin. It is not a realistic solution to achieve a secure peace with long durance. And this can be proven, no, thank you, by different facts in the history that have achieved these unrealistic solutions. Starting with the Crimea Peninsula, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is very old, but the crisis turned violent in March of 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula of the Black Sea, by Russia, and deepened months later with the uprising of pro-Russians revealed in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, part of the Donbass. So here we have Putin asking for negotiations, but then instead they kept the territories and start new wars as the one with Ukraine. Then the policy of appeasement. We all know that after the First World War, there was a policy intended by the Britons to guarantee negotiations with the one that expect to expand their territories, for example, with Hitler and Mussolini. No, thank you. But instead, they wanted to achieve peace by negotiations and diplomatic relationships, intended that these dictators will accept them. But instead, they only give time for them to start their new Second World War. Finally, we can see, for example, in the Israel versus the Palestinians, where we all have negotiations about the territories, but instead we have a 70 years war. Continue with the second layer of analysis in the Russian point of view. It is unrealistic. Yes.
What other method to achieve peace does team opposition propose other than negotiations?
Well, I think that, for example, firstly, that we clarify that we want war, but this is not the manner of negotiating Ukraine with Putin. We also ask, for example, an international agreement, or thinking in those, the USA and those people that really want to help Ukraine and not save their own economy, instead of not helping them, for example, with army or with supplies, they are only intending them to give in into Russia what they want. Continue with my argument, the Russian point of view. It is unrealistic to negotiate with Putin as negotiating in this moment in favor of the authoritarian of Russia is to give in into these authoritarian states. As Olakasandra Matviiuk, the Nobel Peace Award of the current year, said, Putin did not start the invasion of Ukraine because he fears OTAN, but just because he fears freedom. The Russian has used terrorist methods to only achieve these territories, and instead of uniting the Russian race, they are only want to invade these places because, no, thank you, because they don't want peace. So they have broken a series of international agreements, the Minsk agreement, and also the international charter that shows that Putin do not want to negotiate. And if he negotiates, then he will break these agreements. Continue with my second argument, the cultural one, a fight or an extermination campaign. They want to exterminate the Ukraine culture. They are completely going against the human rights and the right of Ukraine to continue with their own culture and their own thoughts. The Russians want to invade this because they want to annex it to Russia, because they think there are a lot of Russians, but instead they are not thinking that the Ukraine culture will disappear. How are you going to negotiate with a genocide that only wants to achieve his own culture? Olakasandra Matviiuk also affirmed that Putin have said that the Ukrainian nation does not exist and that the state, culture, and language have no right to exist, which is clear a sign of the intention of genocide that this war wants. So are you going to negotiate with a genocide that this person is even violating the international law and the international human rights? Does the proposition really think that negotiation with Putin is going to stop a real catastrophe? Or don't you think that in the future, Putin will alterate these genocide things and start a worldwide catastrophe as a third World War? Putin has used methods such as rapes, torture, and murders. He has used terrorist thinkings and terrorist methods that we should not allow, and we should not negotiate with him. Don't forget that terrorists impose their ideas by force without accepting other ideas. So how are you going to negotiate with a person that does not accept a person think as the same as he thinks? And we know this because he had murdered thousands of people that is an opposite of his own regime in his own country. This whole idea proves that the negotiations will cooperate with the advance of the imposition of the Russian culture suppressing the Ukrainian one. So we will not settle for breadcrumbs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time was 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
I now invite Felix Brembro to continue the case for the proposition.
Am I audible? Great.
Loud and clear.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before even starting with the refutations of everything that they just said, I want to note, Pan, this is a comparative debate. This means it's not either our solution or nothing. They have to say, sure, if they want to end the war, how would you end the war? Saying you're going to have an international agreement is just a fancy word for negotiating. The fact that they're standing for international agreements in itself proves that they're standing for what we're standing. They realize that the only possible way to actually end the war in the first place is sitting at a negotiating table and say, hey, Putin, what you're doing is wrong. We have to do this, this, and this. Therefore, like their counter model or whatever they want to call it, in itself is already biased for our side of the house, but we're still giving them a chance in their second and third speech to come up with a new one. Please, opposition, bring something. In my speech, expect first some refutations to their points and 3 main points of refutation. First, ensure the peace. Second, a realistic solution. And third, extermination campaign. Then some reconstruction of our first and second arguments, and our third argument called the least. Starting with their for their side of house. Ensuring the peace. Their side of house basically said, like, they don't want to come to the negotiation table. Why would Putin ever come to the negotiation table? We brought you fundamental reasons in our first and second arguments. First, no, thank you. Winter is coming. It's very likely to have a deadlock of the war itself. That's not beneficial for Russia. Having constantly spending money on money in a war that's not advancing is not beneficial for Russia itself. Therefore, like the seasons are not beneficial for Russia, and it's time for them to come to the table. Second, Ukraine is advancing. In the war, Ukraine has minor setbacks from the Ukrainian invasion. It has had some taken back land. Those are the kind of things that show Ukraine has actually some force, something that Russia never expected. Still, this is not like enough to take down Russia itself, but it's enough to sit in a table and for Russia to recognize what kind of power each side of the house has. Second, third, international agreements need negotiations. This goes back to what I said in my motivator, but basically their side of the house is bringing a counter model that's similar to our side of the house. They're giving it another name, but international agreements, that's what they stand for, is literally going to a negotiation table, sitting with Putin and saying, hey, this is my international agreement. Therefore, they're saying that we should also go to the negotiation table. They're standing for our side of the house. Fourth, even if all this wasn't true, even if Putin is come to the table, what's the alternative panel? The alternative is keep on bombing infrastructure in Ukrainian land, keep on bombing houses, keep on bombing nurseries, keep on bombing hospitals. Those are the kind of things that we're trying to avoid in the first place. We don't understand why opposition wants to keep on bombing Ukraine, keep on supporting Russia. That's something that's not realistic from their side of the house. Starting with our second point of refutation, unrealistic solution. Basically, what they brought here was like, oh, in World War I, there was some kind of problem. Israel and Palestine has other kind of problems. Judges, like, first of all, I think it's kind of obvious to point out most of these examples are not relevant. What happened in the 1920s is not relevant to what's happening nowadays in 2022, where most of the technology has changed, when the international paradigm has changed itself. Like President remark is so far off the table, they don't even get to it. Second, things change currently. We have seen that the war is not just starting. It's not that the war has started a month ago and they're going to the negotiation table right away. The war has started in February. We had months and months of destruction of Ukrainian land, of destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. I think enough has developed as for us to see, hey, Putin, that's the interest that they have, that's the interest that they have. It's not an unprecedented kind of war. We have already had some time to think about it, and we think that Putin will come to the table with it. Third, in our previous point of representation, we told you why they were coming to the table. Fourth, third point of representation, the extermination campaign. This was their second argument when they said they basically want to exterminate Ukrainians.
Point of information.
I'll take it in a moment. Two things to answer to this. First of all, if they're exterminating people, if they're exterminating culture, don't you want them to stop? If you're going to stop, the only way to do it is through negotiations. Therefore, our house is still standing. Second, just because Putin says these kind of things, which don't even necessarily mean that he means it, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily dumb. That doesn't mean that if a good opportunity presents for him to go to the negotiation table, he will miss it. We think that besides his ideas, he's likely to go to the negotiation table because it's convenient for him. Because Russia is not likely to withstand a long winter fighting against Ukraine, spending money on that issue. That's why the 3 points of representation falls to our side house. In our first argument, we told you that peace negotiations were the only realistic option. This is something that they conceded with their counter model. Second, we told you it's a perfect time to negotiate. Why? Because Russia is at a slight disadvantage that it wasn't before, and it's likely not to be in the future. Therefore, it's a perfect moment for both Ukraine and Russia to come to the table. Taking that into consideration, I want to start with the third argument, but before doing that, I'll take your POI.
How are you going to get both? How is it the best time for both countries to negotiate when clearly both parts are not wanting to negotiate? Who is going to make them go and sit in a negotiation table?
Judges, it really seems as if they're not listening to what we're saying. They keep asking the same question and we answer it over and over again. Because it's winter, it's not likely to develop as much. Russia cannot spend as much money in the conflict as it could before because of the economic problems that it's having. The context in itself is pressuring Ukraine to go to a negotiation table. In itself, Ukraine has to go because all of its funders and all of the countries that give them money have to go to a negotiating table and want them to go to a negotiating table. And Russia's benefited because they're not in an economic situation to actually keep on fighting the war they have. Whether they want it or not, both parties have to sit in the negotiation table because they're both benefited because of it. Taking that into consideration, that again, we've answered this a lot of times already. No, thank you. Starting with the third argument. The thesis of this argument, engagement with Putin, allow for a transition for smaller but yet significant milestones. The premise of this argument is that negotiations are nuanced. This means it doesn't mean that one day from another you're going to achieve total peace. It means that it's a process. It's likely to take some weeks, even some months. In those weeks and months, in that time frame, you're likely to have several little accomplishments that in the general scale or international scale does not seem as significant, but are very important for the local populations. Why would this happen? Two fundamental mechanisms. First of all, we're talking about small compromises. What does this mean? What does this look like? It looks like, for instance, interchanging dead bodies or interchanging prisoner of wars, even establishing peace zones as not to fight in those specific places. These are smaller compromises that not necessarily affect the outcome of the general war, but still are beneficial for those people living in those areas, those people whose prisoner of war cousin is coming back to their country. That's the benefit that we're trying to look. Second, we're talking about mutual benefits. It's not only with these compromises that Ukraine is benefited or only that Russia is benefited, but by exchanging prisoner of wars, both parties are benefited. By establishing peace zones, both parties are benefited. Those are the kind of things that both parties would agree to because they have interests in these kind of situations. Therefore, these fundamental mechanisms allow for impacts to occur. But what are our impacts? Three main impacts. First of all, you're going to have local impacts in the site itself, like for instance, prisoner of wars who are going back to their families, or nuclear cities or nuclear plants stop being fighting over. Those are the kind of things that locally have a lot of impacts, but internationally are not as significant. Second, internationally, you're very likely to have much more expansion of the economy. This means by establishing small compromises, we're very likely to have Ukraine export grains back to East Africa, avoiding famine in those places, and Russia is very likely to be able to transit gas to Europe. Those are the benefits that we're looking at. Third, you're very likely to have long-term benefits. These small things contribute to a long-term solution. Panel, notice our arguments are still standing. So we're still begging opposition to give peace, a realistic peace, a chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time was 8 minutes and 17 seconds.
I would now like to invite Camila Castillo to continue the case for the opposition.
Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. If both sail in opposite directions, they will never reach the same destiny. Welcome judges, members of the proposition and audience. Throughout my speech today, I will be providing with my rebuttal of what the proposition has had to say throughout their debate. And following this, I will deliver our third argument, surrendering Ukraine in a silver platter. Such argument gives us a political point of view, thus providing to both judges and proposition with even more reasons to why a negotiation between Ukraine and Putin is not possible and should not happen. First of all, I would like to start with the refutal. I have here 3 main points of that I would want to refute about what proposition has had to say throughout their debate. First of all, they began by saying that considering a negotiation right now is the best option and that the international community is supporting Ukraine right now. To this, I would like to ask you, how is a negotiation being considered the best option when parts of the parts that are supposed to be negotiation do not want to? This was proven by the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, which stated in a video in the 5th of November to the Security Council that they would not negotiate as long as Putin was president. So even though proposition says that we keep asking the same thing over and over, no, thank you, that we keep asking the same thing over and over again, this is something that we should take into the consideration, as we cannot force two parts to negotiate when they don't want to, and when they have stated 2 weeks ago that they would not negotiate as long as Putin was president. And also I would like to ask, Shouldn't Ukraine have the support of the international community in the future and their support again? Are we giving limited support to Ukraine? They only have it right now. What sense does this make? And what does this say about the support that we give to those that need it?
On that point,
No, thank you. Our second point of refutation. The proposition stated that it is time for Russia to negotiate as it is winter and it benefits them to negotiate and not to be in a war. So the proposition wants to benefit a terrorist that is such as Putin. Is that what the proposition stands for? Just because it is winter, as I previously explained, the other part in the negotiation does not want to negotiate. So why would be take into consideration that maybe just because Russia is in winter, they now want to negotiate? The fact is that maybe Putin wants to negotiate because they have realized that they are losing the war, and that is what is impulsing them to negotiate when Ukraine is once and finally advancing and they are losing. Finally, the third point of reputation, the proposition has said that this will stop every effect that the war is bringing, meaning bombs and the extradition of the culture, as my first speaker already explained. But how is this going to be stopping the effects of the war when they also stated that a negotiation would be beneficial, taking as long as it should take? So when is it going to stop these effects? And they also said that the history of the...
point of information.
Yes.
In the course of peace negotiations, there will be de-escalation and minimizing effects of the war until peace, which is something that it falls to our side of the house and not to yours. Don't you agree?
I understand your point, but this is what I was going for. That is that you stated that the previous history does not matter, but in fact it does, because it proves to us that even if a peace negotiation happened right now, it will only give Putin the chance to keep on doing this for more and over again in the future, as has been done through history with the Minsk agreements, like my first speaker previously explained. So the proposition is not taking into acknowledge the fact that Putin is only doing this because it is going to give him the chance to commit these crimes over and over again. Now, following with my argument number 3, a political point of view, surrendering Ukraine in a silver platter. Let's talk about the international right of democratic countries principles. First, we have the principle of autodetermination that states that every country can decide how to rule and govern their country. This principle was completely ignored by Putin. Also, the principle of not affecting its sovereignty. It is the principle that related to the ownership of sovereignty in a state, which organizes and legitimizes state power of axiom of its ownership by the people. Again, violated by Putin. Will we continue allowing this? What about a condemnation of acts against human rights Putin has done? There is evidence that he has violated international law on multiple occasions. There has been documented torture, rape, fatal beatings during the imprisonment. And we believe it is a shame. No, thank you. It is a shame that the international community has not provided the legal instruments to stop this situation, because as the proposition stated, they are just supporting Ukraine right now and not before. So will these acts go by unpunished? Are we completely ignoring the damage those damaged by Putin's action? Here we can prove that we are actually going into a further side. We're looking at a democratic country principles, no thank you, and a dark and violent authoritarian side completely violating such principles. This allows me to transition to the real problem being ignored here, as we are putting a band-aid on a broken bone. Let's talk about the real problem. You want to impose a certain political model in a world, a political model that does not allow inclusion and cultural identity, as we previously already explained. There is a latent conflict happening and will not be solved with such a negotiation if it were to happen. Let's take a look at Russia's allies, China, North Korea, and Iran, a great example of how all authoritarian regimes support each other and help each other out. The facts are, no thank you, the facts are that although Russia will never admit that it has lost the war to Ukraine, they are actually losing the war. That is why Putin actually right now wants to negotiate, not because it is winter. So why negotiate with right now when Ukraine is finally advancing? Not only has Russia's image as a country and as a military power, no thank you, been seriously damaged, but economically the country has lost its great assets, the sale of raw materials. So Putin is now wanting to accept a negotiation because of this. To what point can a negotiation be successfully done when the terms are not fulfilled, as Putin has always done, like we have shown through history, that no thank you, that the proposition is completely ignoring? Why are conditions set by Ukraine, like the country's integrity being repaired and reparations paid by Moscow, or the guarantee that this warlike scenario will not repeat in the future, so hard for Putin to accept? Is it too much for him to give, or has he realized that accepting these terms that Ukraine set would stop him from spreading his authoritarian model throughout the world, and in this particular case, throughout Ukraine?
Yo.
It is very clear, no, thank you. It is very clear that this is a war between two systems, democracy and authoritarianism, and Ukraine is just a window of this fight. So can we really negotiate with an authoritarian government, with a criminal indeed as Putin is? Is an authoritarianism with which nothing can be negotiated going to be prioritized? And are we going to allow him to keep on spreading throughout history like he has already done? Can we offer Ukraine to a big bad wolf and tell Ukraine to fight alone for all of democracy, and instead we are just standing back and watching? So we are sending him and Ukraine alone to fight this conflict when we haven't realized that actually it's a conflict that involves everyone and should be provided the support all of the time, as the proposition has stated that they only provide support the international community right now because they state that this is the good time to negotiate. So shouldn't this support be provided all through the war and all through the conflict? Why are we only supporting this person and this country right now when truly they are fighting for what we stand for and for what all of our countries are ruled by, which is a democracy? A negotiation between Ukraine and Putin will only hide the actual problem and will not stop the real problem, the root of the problem. It will benefit Putin and allow the spread of his authoritarian model to keep happening on the long run. At the beginning of our debate, we asked Team Proposition to prove three aspects, one of them being that this negotiation will help preserve democracy and not cooperate with Putin's interest of spreading an authoritarian model. However, through this argument, we have proved to you that this aspect and confirmed such a negotiation between Ukraine and Putin would achieve quite the contrary, and therefore it should not happen. We will not settle for breadcrumbs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time was 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
I would now like to invite Thomas Emch to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you. Can you hear me correctly? Okay, I will start in 3, 2, 1. 240,000 dead and wounded. Among them, over 1,000 dead children. I ask you, how many more must perish until opposition accepts to go into negotiations? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me remind you that the motion before us today is this House believes that Ukraine should negotiate with Putin to end the war. Throughout this debate, on the side of Team Proposition, we have stood for the only realistic solution to end this war, which must be carried out now as it is the best possible time both for Ukraine and Russia and for the possibilities of a long-lasting peace. And it will, in the course of making these negotiations, will use the impact on Ukrainian people the most possible. And now I will now continue to summarize and refute the main points provided by Team Opposition and revise the points provided by Team Proposition throughout this debate in 3 main points of clash. The first one being how to end the war, the second one being on the consequences of negotiations, and the third one being the political argument. Now, starting with my first point of clash on how to end the war. From Team Opposition side, we have seen absolutely no countermodel. Team Proposition has recognized the realistic situation of the conflict and of any conflict throughout history. Wars end either by a settled, negotiated peace or by the complete destruction of one of the two parties. There is no other option. There is nothing else to do. If we want to stop the pain, the suffering, the deaths of the Ukrainian people, which Team Opposition has so eloquently developed, then we must negotiate. There is no other option. As a countermodel, they said we should do an international agreement. Well, I ask you, how are you going to do an international agreement with no negotiations? You're living in a fairy tale. We must negotiate.
Point of information.
And accept it.
Isn't the proposition aware that you are defending to negotiate Ukraine with Putin and not international agreements and other people to help? You are supporting that Putin will negotiate with Ukraine.
I understand your point. Thank you. I understand your point. I'm sorry, what other option does team opposition provide to deal with Putin? What else can we do? Do we continue the war indefinitely? At whose cost? At the Ukrainians' cost. Must Ukrainians bleed, die, perish? Women be weeping with no children, children be left orphaned, men killed in the battlefield, mutilated, dismembered. How much more must this go on before you realize that there is really no other way to deal with Putin than to negotiate? We can't just say, oh, I don't agree with Putin, he's a bad guy, he's authoritarian. Yeah, we agree too, but he's a world actor. He is the leader of Russia, a world power, and we must deal with him. And the only way to deal with him and to ensure that less people die and less people suffer is to negotiate. And furthermore, from our side of the house, we have developed extensively on why this is the best time to end the war. Firstly, because winter is approaching, so it is unlikely that any of the two sides, no thank you, will make any further progress in the front lines. Recently, Ukraine has made some advances, with the recapture of Kherson, which gives them some more negotiating power in the negotiations. However, this will not extend into the winter. They do not have the capacities to launch an offensive campaign during the winter, and if they do, it will mean the deaths of thousands more people. Secondly, Russia is suffering because of this war. Okay, this is taking a huge economic toll on them. So there's also an interest on the part of the Russians to negotiate. And as team opposition has been totally contradictory on this issue. At first you said that neither of the two sides wanted to negotiate, and then you said that Putin does want to negotiate. And we welcome if Putin wants to negotiate because it's the only way to end the war. So this point falls squarely on our side. Furthermore, we have developed how support for the West is not unconditional, as team opposition seems to believe. Okay, we might discuss as to whether this is selfish, whether this should be the case, whether they should support them unconditional. But the
point of information.
The realistic situation, no, thank you. The realistic situation is that support for Ukraine will not be unconditional. Okay, polls in the UK, in the US, in Germany, in France, in all of Ukraine's major backers indicate that people want Ukraine to enter negotiations. Okay, they will not be in favor of their country, sending billions of dollars in weaponry and financing Ukraine indefinitely. Okay, at some point, Western support will end. Okay, and when that happens, the prospects of a peace which will benefit Ukraine and which will allow for a flourishing democracy, which team opposition wants to establish in Ukraine, and for the preservation of Ukraine's democratic rights, no thank you, and for the defense of the culture, will be null. There will be no prospects for that type of outcome because they will lack the support necessary. No thank you, and the situation necessary to enforce those terms in the negotiations. Now, to move on to my second point of clash on the consequences of negotiations. Now, from team opposition side, the only real, let's say, refutation, if you might call it that way, but I would disagree, as to negotiations was that, negotiations historically have failed. They brought up appeasement, which we have disregarded totally because it's a completely anachronistic example. Okay, we can't seriously take an example from the 1930s or 20s. I'm bringing it into today. Okay, the world stage has changed. No, thank you. They did bring up the example of Israel and Palestine. And yes, it's true, there have been negotiations and the conflict goes on. But where would we be if there were no negotiations? Okay, where would we be? There have been countless agreements, countless ceasefires between Israel and Palestine, which although they have failed over time, although there have been problems, although it's at times, ugly agreements, which both sides have to concede, but in the end, they have immensely reduced the pain and the suffering and the deaths and the injured on both sides. Okay? So even if it does not achieve a 1,000-year peace, it will surely achieve some type of peace. And even if it does not reach an end of the war favorable to Ukraine, it will, as my second speaker developed, it will give the diplomatic channels necessary to reach more achievable goals. For example, the exchange of prisoners of war, for example, the exchange of corpses, for example, allowing Ukraine to export grain to the world so that people in East Africa and the Middle East don't starve. Opposition doesn't seem to care about these people. Neither do they seem to care about the countless of people who will perish if Ukraine continues the war. Even for Russia, they want to export fertilizer. So there's many agreements, preliminary agreements, which can be made in the course of negotiations short of the end of the war, which will only be allowed if we enter into negotiations to end the war. Okay, it's not simply we enter negotiations, nothing happens for months, and then we end the war. Okay, there's many preliminary agreements which will do so much impact on reducing the suffering of people. It will, it will establish safe zones. I mean, we're playing with fire here. There's an active nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, which is receiving, constant bombardment. Okay, we're in the risk of a nuclear disaster now. team opposition says Putin's not a diplomatic man, but we say, yeah, he might be a terrible man, he might be a genocidal, dictator, but he's not suicidal. Okay, he's not a total maniac. Okay, he does not want a nuclear disaster. So there are things which both sides can agree on, short of the end of the world. So on the consequences of negotiations, even if it's not the best peace necessary, it will ensure some type of peace and will really diminish the suffering in the course of time. Now, finally, on the political argument, they have said how making peace will concede to Putin and will be the West bowing down to the authoritarian model, and we're violating Ukraine's principle of self-determination. Now, this is ridiculous, okay? Because ending the war doesn't mean that there will be no condemnation of Ukraine's Russia's actions. Okay, there have been already condemnations in the UN, and there are economic sanctions imposed which can continue after the war ends. So there's many ways in which the West can punish Russia for its actions. And furthermore, I mean, there is no other way to end the war. Okay, so yeah, sure, the peace deal might be ugly. There might be some concessions that must be made, but there is no other way to end the war. Okay, if you want to stop Putin's authoritarian model from advancing, then you must end the war. Okay, otherwise it will be imposed on all of Ukraine and will be exterminated. So to summarize, they have been totally unable to refute the need for negotiations. They have been totally unable to refute why negotiations should take place now and not later, with a complete disregard for human life. And they have been unable to establish really any serious political precedent of us bowing to Russia. And therefore, that is why we believe that the debate falls on our side. And I ask you, retaking the first question I made, how many more? Okay, how many more weeping mothers? How many more orphan children? How many more people killed before team opposition allows for negotiations? We beg opposition to give peace a chance.
Thank you very much. Time was 8 minutes and 34 seconds.
Okay, so I go in 3, 2, 1. Go. Proposition is following the path to mediocrity. Are we really going to follow them? Welcome audience, judges, my worthy opponents. As a member of Team Oppos, today the motion was, this house believes that the Ukrainian government should negotiate with Putin to end the war. As a member of Team Opposition, I strongly believe that this motion should and must fall, and we have shown this throughout all this debate. Okay, through this debate, Team Proposition failed to prove that this negotiation would bring war peace for a long term, avoiding future war scenarios. Failed to prove that these negotiations would not cooperate with the advance of the imposition of the Russian culture, suppressing the Ukrainian one. They also failed proving that this would help to preserve democracy and not cooperate with Putin's interest of spreading an authoritarian model. And finally, that throughout these negotiations, the human rights would be guaranteed. All this was a failure for Team Proposition. Okay, so now, refuting some points that Team Proposition said through this debate. I divided in 3 main points of information. The first one, they said that peace talks minimalize, and that's it. Peace talks minimalize and doesn't end the war. Second, we give opposition the chance to consider peace, and we are not against peace. We want peace, but we are aware, and we all know, no thank you, that negotiations with this man, Vladimir Putin, is impossible. And we gave examples of history, and I will remind an example of the present because they asked for. Okay, so the second point of information here, no, thank you, was talking about that we should negotiate now, that Ukraine is winning. No, let justice exist. We are not against peace, as I was saying, but negotiating with Putin is really difficult. Why should we be signing something that will benefit Putin? And now they talked about signing in winter because it would be easier to face this season. No, thank you. So you are supporting a terrorist. Can you imagine this? Also, the third was talking about the economical aspect, because they talked all about, I mean, the acceptation of these negotiations would make Russia get these 2 zones that are asking for, which are in fact industrialized zones. So the accepting of these negotiations would be a benefit for Russia and perjudicating Ukraine. Okay, no, thank you. They also talked about giving the best solution, and this takes me to the point of clash. On this debate, I found 3 main points of clash. The first one, man is the only race who treats with the same rocks twice. They said that the best solution to end the war was negotiation. They also said that what happened in the history was not relevant. So I give you the example of the Minsk agreement, as a more actual example, which also was broken by Putin. Okay, so team opposition thinks all the contrary. This is not the best solution. You are avoiding the fact that the negotiation is not useful in this case. And we said this with our first argument, showing that worldwide, historically negotiations have only calmed the situation, but in the long run has never, has led finally to catastrophes. Also talking about that it's unrealistic to negotiate and achieve peace for long, no thank you. And also with our second layer, talking only about Russia, we explained that Putin likes conflicts. And I could give you example of Chechnya in the 2000, of Georgia in the 2008, and of Syria in 2015. And let me tell you something, judges, if negotiations with Russia would work from the beginning, all these three problems that existed after the problem with Chechnya would have never existed. So that's why negotiation doesn't work. This point falls for team opposition. Also, our second point of clash, danger zone. They talked about that if Ukraine doesn't accept peace negotiations after this situation, the support would be less. However, we all know that negotiation would mean the ending of the Ukrainian community, and we explained this with our second argument, where we clearly explained that they want to exterminate the race, that Ukraine can't permit this. No, thank you. Do you really want to negotiate with a genocide? They are violating international laws. We all know that Putin is not a good man who makes good for the society. He is a terrorist, and he has shown this through history and after the 20th and on the actuality. Also, here we have a deep proof that sovereignty of Ukraine will not be respected in negotiations, and a negotiation will not be fair for both sides and will bring punishment proportional to the damage caused. So that's why this point falls for team opposition. The third point of clash here was fallacies. Team proposition said that negotiations would stop the effects. Yes.
Could the opposition propose any other means to end the war, which will?
I get your point. And team opposition has not the duty to propose another solution. We talked about a peace. We talked about an international treaty, for example, but we have not the duty to propose another solution. But our role here is criticize and justify why negotiations with Vladimir Putin are not working and will never work. Okay, so as I was saying, our third point of clash, fallacies. They said that negotiations will stop the effects. However, this is an unrealistic solution and unrealistic effects. Unrealistic solutions because they don't get along, and I will explain this further. Also, unrealistic effects because, yes, Russia, for example, in a city went back of a city. They tried to go out, but before doing this, they broke all the city. What's the sense of this? Okay, so now going to our to the argument that supports this point of clash. We are talking about a fight between democracy and authoritarianism, where Putin is violating rights and principles of the international right of democracy. So we know that negotiation is possible only when both sides are open, and in this case, this is not happening. So negotiations would just let Russia advance, as it has occurred since history, and we know that this negotiation is not fair and will benefit Putin, as I have said. Okay, so on this debate, team opposition, that's why this point of clash also falls for team opposition, making this. No, thank you. Okay, as I was saying, recapping our team's argument, talking about the historical aspect, we talked about how this would, we talked about first the worldwide aspect, giving example of how historical negotiations have only calm situations, but in the long run has led to catastrophes. We also talked about the second layers of analysis deeply in Russia, which is the case here of the motion, in which we explain that Putin likes conflicts. Chechnya, Georgia, Syria. Are these three examples just necessary to realize that Putin is a person who we can negotiate with? Judges, think please. This is clear. The situation is clear here. Also, our second argument talked about the cultural aspect. They want to exterminate a race. Do you really support this? Will you negotiate with a genocide? They are violating international laws, as I was saying. International laws are really important to preserve world peace. And yes, by this method that they want to impose, peace will not be guaranteed. Our third and last argument, talking about the political aspect, showing that this is a war between democracy and authoritarianism, that Putin is violating rights and principles in the international right of democracy. He is a terrorist. As I am saying, Putin is a terrorist. So negotiations would just benefit Russia, and the negotiation is not fair and would benefit Putin, which in fact is what he wants. So now that it's just you and me, judges, remember that team proposition is not showing how signing peace would avoid all the conflict they talk about. Be aware that Putin is a terrorist. And second, remember that their third speaker motivator is accepting the fact that human rights are being violated. So please remember, we will not settle for breadcrumbs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time was 8 minutes and 5 seconds.
Thank you very much. Teams will now have 1 minute to prepare the reply speeches, starting with the opposition and ending with the proposition. Okay, time's up. I would now like to invite Camila Castillo to deliver the reply speech for the opposition.
Okay, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back, judges, members of the proposition and audience. I am here now to develop our reply speech. Let's begin by remembering our quote, if both sail in opposite directions, they will never reach the same destiny. Now, first, I would like to start by explaining to you some of the burden of proof that the proposition stated they will prove throughout their debate. Their first point was, it is the only pragmatic solution. However, the opposition answers to this that it is not possible to negotiate diplomatically with an authoritarian terrorist, as has been proved throughout the debate. So they, however, did not prove how it was the only solution when it is not possible. Second point that they said they would prove, it is the best solution at the time. However, opposition has tackled this by explaining that it is not best, as history already explained, and as proposition has failed to take into consideration, that negotiation with Putin never works, regardless of the weather. It does not work through history, hasn't worked, and a proposition seems to be ignoring this. Third point, minimizing the effects of war would be a consequence of this negotiation. However, opposition has tackled this in 2 ways. First of all, the proposition also stated that it would be a good solution no matter how long it took. So to what point is it really minimizing the effects when we don't know how long it's going to take? Second of all, there is a future conflict that will be generated, as has been done through history, because the negotiation allows it. And this is what proposition keeps ignoring. History shows us that a negotiation with Putin alone is not the best solution. It is not a solution at all, as it is not possible. Now let's move on with the burden of proof that opposition asks proposition to complete. First of all, the opposition asks that a negotiation would bring peace for a long term, avoiding future war scenarios. The proposition did not complete this burden, as they completely ignored history and what it shows. However, the opposition managed by a historical argument to show you that history must be taken into consideration, as it proves that Putin is not going to be satisfied with a negotiation, and we have to take this into consideration. Second point, throughout this negotiation, human rights will be guaranteed. First of all, the proposition never guaranteed anything about the human rights. In fact, as the opposition stated, human rights are being violated, and they agreed to this with the motivator of the third speaker. So what happens to the human rights? Where did proposition tackle the human rights that are nowadays being violated? 3 point, this negotiation will not cooperate with the advance of imposition of the Russian culture, suppressing the Ukrainian one. Proposition failed to take culture into consideration. They failed to tackle these cultural effects at all. However, opposition showed with a cultural argument that showing that going Putin's way and negotiating with them would only make the suppression of the Ukrainians' culture even bigger. So throughout the debate, proposition failed to show anything of the burden of proof that opposition asked, and they also did not mention them at all. They do not answer the questions that opposition asked them. I would also like to clarify two main things. The proposition keeps asking the opposition to come up with another solution. However, we as opposition are not here to do your job, but we are here to show you how this solution that you are given is illogical and not possible. And this has been complete throughout the opposition's debate. This is why they do not bring a possible solution or a logical solution. Opposition has proved this through many arguments and history and facts that the proposition it completely ignores. This is why the motion should and must fall for the opposition side. We will not settle for breadcrumbs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time was 3 minutes and 50 seconds.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Felix Brembo to finish this debate.
Am I audible? Great. Okay, give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What's curious about this debate is that they changed their strategy mid-speeches. The first and second speech were noted by a strategy that was simply saying, oh, the war is something bad, therefore we should have an international agreement. When we told them, hey, an international agreement falls to our side of the house, they changed and pivoted in the third and reply speech. They then said Ukraine will submit to Russia and they're going to propose no solution at all. Judges, if they're going to bring no solution at all, then we're able to assume they're sticking with the status quo. That's a premise for this speech. In my speech, expect 3 main points of clash. First, Putin's will. Second, the outcome of the negotiations. And third, the long-term impacts. Starting with Putin's wills. From their side house, we heard 3 main lines of attack. First, they say Putin won't want to stay in the negotiations. We told you that that's not an actual refutation to our constructive analysis. We told you, first, the winter conditions allow for a stalemate, which do not benefit Russia in any way. Second, the economic pressure Russia has leads them to wanting to end the war as quickly as possible because they're not able to spend as much money as they could in the past. And third, Ukraine has to sit in the table because all of the people that give them money, that give them weapon, want them to sit in the table. Like the international pressure is up on them to sit on the table. Their only answer was like, oh, the international pressure is something that never stops. It's unconditional. We told you that's not true, panel. Like UK, France, United States all want Ukraine to sit in the negotiation table. Therefore, Ukraine will do it. Second line of attack, they told us Putin is a genocide. Sure, we told you we know he is genocide. Therefore, we're the only side of the house that are actually willing to tackle that genocide. And we're only that are willing to take that person to a table and to actually stop what they're doing. Therefore, their point about exterminating cultures falls to our side. The third line of attack was like, oh, we're not going to bring in any alternative because of what happened in Chechnya and Georgia. If they're not bringing any alternative, they're standing for a status quo. If they're standing for a status quo, their situation is either going to end like Chechnya, which ended in a genocide, or like Georgia, which ended in negotiations. Either scenario wins to our side of the house because we don't want a genocide. And if negotiations happens, we win. Second point of clash, the outcome of the negotiations. Their only point here was like, oh, Russia's going to impose a political system over Ukraine. Three main answers. First of all, not necessarily. The fact that Ukraine is sitting down at the table with Russia does not mean that they're going to accept any term that Russia gives them to them. Even when you prove that, okay, Russia's being weak nowadays, that Putin does not have the economic power nowadays as it has in the past, which was proved by their second speaker, proves that Russia does not have the power to impose a political system. The fact that they're sitting at the negotiation table allows for a lot of side benefit that we told you in our second and third argument, which we'll end refuted with, but does not necessarily mean we're going to absorb Ukraine into Russia. Third, we told you that this process of negotiation has minor milestones that are important. This means the exchange of prisoners of war, establishment of safe zone, of the exchange of dead bodies. Those are the kind of things that are beneficial to most of the people. They accepted it, but do not affect the major scale, therefore little likely to happen. Those are the kind of benefits that put us over a margin from their side of the house. Now discuss the long term. These had two main lines of attacks here. One, there will be no long-term condemnation of Russia. Two things. One, of course, there are going to be long-term condemnation, like because of everything you said, you're like proving against your point. And second, we told you that economic sanctions are imposed and are going to be imposed in the future. Like those kind of things, we still think that are going to be able to succeed. And then you told us in the long term, we're not going to solve the problem. First, we proved why we would solve the problem in the long term. These little successes that we told you about, the exchange of prisoners of war, etc. It marks a strong precedent as for a long-term solution. But second, even if we didn't do this, panel tickets are a very worst, even if we only had short-term solutions, notice that it's best than continuing the war. Therefore, comparatively, even a worst case scenario, we still have short-term solutions, which is best than no solutions at all. This is proved by the Minsk treaty that it brought. Finally, one last time, we beg opposition to give peace a chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time was 4 minutes and 2 seconds.
Okay, congratulations both teams for an excellent performance day. Whenever the judges are ready, they are going to be redirected to another room so that they can deliver and come back with the winner of the day.
Congratulations.
It was
Congratulations.
A good evening.
can sense some nerves. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. Not just congratulations, but thank you very much. Once a year, we have a grand final of the Oak Cup, which is the highest level that you can reach, at least domestically, and it is usually the creation ground for all of the debaters that will represent Team Argentina internationally. So it's always a blast to watch your development over the years, but especially the culmination of a whole year in a simple debate, especially when it is a prepared motion and you've thought it for a long while. Now, before we get into the proper briefing of what the judges saw in this debate, I'd like to congratulate you not only on the style you both had, not only on the content and on the strategy you brought, but on the way that you integrated debate to your normal lives. I am positive that you are your fathers and mothers' nightmares at the dinner table. I am confident that with your friends or with yourselves, you're constantly debating. Okay, this is not a tool meant to destroy or to put your position over another's. Okay, it is great, and we use it as a sport specifically for that. Okay, but it is an internal tool. We all like to brag about empathy and how we all understand everybody, but the reality is that the only way to properly understand yourselves and your idea is by testing them. And by having that fine sense of argumentation, that's the only way in which you can put your ideas in test, okay? And you're kind of addicted to doing that, which is great because you never marry ideas. You understand perfectly the fact that if I throw a motion at you, you can properly create a case for and against that motion. And probably you internally are constantly doing that with everything that happens in your lives. And of course, when the stage appears and when another team appears, you do it in a semi-professional manner, trying to overcome your adversary. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for being proper debaters, for having and integrating the debating culture in your lives. I think that this is what the Argentine Debating Association wants most of all. Okay, now going into the debate, I can tell you one thing for sure. It was a split motion. It was a split decision, I'm sorry. Okay, so 4 judges went for a team, another went to the other. We did not have a unanimous decision, and we all thought that that was pretty reasonable, okay, because the scoring was not wild in any of the score sheets at all. What did we see in today's debate? Well, we got a political motion, okay? We got a particular motion, something that we've been talking about over and over and over and over again since February, or even before that, which is that this House believes that the Ukrainian government should negotiate with Putin to end the war, okay? We had a proposition that came forward and specified that there are 2 alternatives, okay? It doesn't matter in which side you're on, there are 2 solutions that this can have. We can either have a solution based on the destruction of the other party or with peace. Now, the means in which we achieve both of those things is kind of scarce at the present time. We got a proposition that said that negotiation is the only pragmatic solution, that it is the best solution, and that it is the only way to minimize the effects of war until a resolution, either acting as a deterrent for escalation or by acting as a promoter of de-escalation, ceasefires, protection of citizens in certain areas, protection of certain human rights at certain points. The arguments were the end, the best, and the last. And we had an opposition that said, we all know how the story ends. Historically, we have several examples. And not only do we have several examples historically, we have several examples with Putin, a name that is specifically engraved in the motion at hand. Okay, so we know the actors, we know the context, we know we know the developments of the conflict, but we went into a back and forth of arguments, okay? We know, and we had a proposition that warned us about the dangers of the motion. We are inches away of ending in a nuclear catastrophe. On the other side, we had an opposition that said, sure, that is the status quo. There are only a handful of things that we could do about it, but negotiations for sure is not one of them. We will only stumble and trip over the same rock again, okay? They started saying that negotiations are impossible unless both parties want to negotiate. And they said that neither party wanted to negotiate. First of all, that Zelensky said so into the Security Council. And second of all, that Putin doesn't want to negotiate because all he is a genocidal terrorist dictator, which wants the destruction of the Ukrainian culture, okay, and the imposition of the Russian culture in Ukraine, okay? They cited several examples. They gave us the historical route throughout the 2014 annexation of Crimea. He talked about how this is only a matter of giving a stalemate until someone wants to do something, and that negotiations can only be put forward when you have leverage. And they gave us the example of Stalin and Hitler only buying time. They gave us the problem about negotiations, that, for example, in Israel and Palestine, we've been negotiating over the last 7 years. Is that what we want? Is that the stalemate we want for the Russian and Ukraine conflict? The proposition came back and said that those examples weren't actually quite relevant because they were old. Every case is different, and that we now have the technology, and that the conditions are simply not the same about Stalin and Hitler. It is nothing to do with Israel and Palestine, okay? And started giving us the context about why this is the best solution. The proposition was a team that understood that the fact that winter was coming meant that the conditions were given to create a stalemate, okay? That the fact that winter would be coming and the fact that we had all these international sanctions and the fact that the economy of both countries are suffering means that winter will be the perfect theater for a negotiation tables to happen. First, Ukraine wants to export wheat. They want to export food. They want to actually have exports and to actually have a developing economy. They said that Russians want that pause at the war and that they want to de-escalate the conflict and impose their proper needs at hand, okay? They talked about how NATO expressed that they are open for negotiations and how what the problems are about blocking infrastructure. Okay, then we went into what's at hand. The opposition said, well, listen, we are in front of someone who doesn't want to negotiate. Why would Zelensky want to negotiate when he's finally winning the war? Not only that, we know that Putin has violated the principle of self-determination, that he has violated the principle of sovereignty, and that he has made several violations of international law. Please remember that in the context of war, it is not human rights, it is humanitarian law, okay, which is kind of the same, but at times of war, no harm done. It is the same thing. And that if someone destroyed my principle of self-determination, my principle of sovereignty, and violated international law all around, why would I want to negotiate with that? Not only did he did all of that, you're telling me that the only solution is to make mutual concessions to someone who just invaded me and things like that. The proposition again said that, well, any other solution that is not negotiation is unrealistic, okay? If they are truly exterminating people, wouldn't we want it to stop, okay? It is the only way we have. It is the only quick way we have is, for example, a ceasefire. And the only way to achieve a ceasefire is by negotiations, okay? So they, again, started imposing the idea that this is a comparative debate. It is not a this or, and that international agreement was only a fancy word for negotiation, okay? And we got into this stage of the debate, which was, what does the opposition want and what does the proposition want? What are you proposing to solve the problem? This is the status quo. The status quo is people dying, is people starving, is people suffering, is the world having the consequences of a war. Not only not only NATO countries, but countries all around the world are in an economic crisis because of this, okay? So what do you want? An international agreement or negotiations? It is the same thing. The proposition is doing the same thing that the opposition is doing, but with other words. And the opposition came back and said, no, this is democracy versus authoritarianism. And what we are in favor is not negotiating with Putin. International agreements meant every single other country apart from Putin. So we had that point done. We talked about the mutual benefits of negotiations and why would the parties accept as long as the long-term benefits. And we had another team that told us that negotiations will only benefit Putin, which was the violator of international law and the one that will get concessions right now. Okay. Then we got into another state of reality. We have a proposition that told us that there were 240,000 people dead or wounded, including children, including bombing of infrastructure, including all sorts of problems, and how we need to end the war, and that the consequences of negotiations are not bad at all, because you can simply say no in a negotiation, and that would bring no harm. Now, the opposition came forward with the Minsk agreement and say, again, how we would not like to trip with the same rock. Putin loves conflict, and they gave us the examples of Chechnya, gave us the example of Georgia, gave us the example of Crimea, and gave us the example of Syria. Again, and very, very important, especially on a prepared motion, explain the examples, okay? Because Georgia and the current conflict have a lot in common, a lot that both teams could have used, okay? There are things that you can relate with all of the examples that you provided, which we all felt that were great. And a case with examples is a case with illustrations, and it is something that gives strength to your idea and to the developments of your arguments, which I felt that was great. But all of the judges felt that in every single point we were lacking a bit of oomph, a bit of a strong conclusion. We got the idea, great. Now, don't leave the conclusion up to the imagination of the audience, the judges, your teachers, and everyone around. Impose your conclusion, okay? We gave you the argument. It is because of this, and give me proper links between the idea, the examples, and the burden of proof that you were trying to defend. Okay. All in all, we felt that this was a great debate, that this was a proper final. We really enjoyed it, and we feel that you enjoyed it as well, which is always a good thing. But unfortunately for us, every single competition needs a winner. And it is probably the worst part about being in these competitions, is this moment of tension in which you don't know if everything was worth it or not. And I can assure you that every single thing was worth it, regardless of the result of this debate. Okay, again, congratulations very, very much. And I would now like to announce the winner of the grand final of the Oak Cup of the Argentine Debating Association for the year 2022, which is Colegio San Jorge of Godoy Cruz, the opposition. Congratulations, both teams. You did a fantastic job all throughout the year. We thoroughly enjoyed it.
Congratulations.
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 And thank you, Judge.